I just want to preface this video by saying, hey, I'm not an expert, I'm just an enthusiast, like many of you out there. I'm not a professional sports photographer. It was the first time I was out using the R7 in this sort of situation, and these are just the observations that I made. That's all. I don't think you can draw up many conclusions, but these are my experiences shooting high speed with the electronic shutter on the R7 at a sports event, namely the World Cup class at the Takapoto Showjumping estate. Let's get into it. Okay guys, so with all that being said, this was my setup for the particular day. I was shooting with the Canon EOS R7 with the EF 70-200mm f2.8L IS USM version 2. Now, how much of my experience and my results came down to the lens paired with the camera, that could be a factor, but all the same, these are the observations I had. So, to the reason for this video, I wanted to check out how the animal tracking and autofocus tracking work with the Canon EOS R7 when shooting at an actual sports event. Now, the great thing about the show jumping is there's a lot of distraction in the actual scene. For instance, there's the fences, there's the people, there's other horses, there's other elements in the frame that could cause the animal tracking, autofocus tracking to have some challenges. And that was exactly why I wanted to shoot this event and exactly why I'm bringing this video to you now. Okay, so to cover off the settings, I had it in shutter priority mode, and I had the shutter speed set at around about 1/1000th of a second, and sometimes it went faster, slower. I had it set on high speed electronic shutter, and at a certain point I adjusted it down to just normal high speed electronic shutter. Look, there's high speed plus, okay, which is up to 30 frames per second, and oh my gosh, that is lightning fast. And then there's the other setting, which is high speed, which is probably more around 15 frames per second. At some point I changed to that because I was simply taking too many photos and also hitting the buffer quite quickly. So partway through shooting, I did change my image quality from RAW to C-RAW or compressed RAW, and that allowed for the buffer to greatly extend, and I still got some great shots. Being that it was broad daylight shooting conditions, I didn't really need the latitude that might be offered in the full RAW image. I'm not actually sure if there is more or less, or what the benefits or cost of using C-RAW over RAW is or are, but nonetheless, I shot in C-RAW and high-speed electronic, high-speed plus electronic shutter mode. Here are the results. We're going to go through a few series and let's just see how the animal tracking firstly picked up on the subject and how it tracked it throughout the course of shooting that high-speed plus or high-speed electronic shutter. Okay, so I've got them on my phone. I'm going to watch along with you. Here is the first series. Now, in this particular series, it was side on to the subject, so the tracking was not challenged so much. It was basically a subject moving across the frame. And as you can see here, as I punch in every few frames, the focus was not too bad. Pretty good, pretty good. I was happy with that. Moving to this series here, way more challenging for the autofocus as the subject is quite small to begin with in the frame and it's advancing towards the camera. So I always find, or I quite often find, that is a challenging situation for camera autofocus. But in this case, with it set on servo as opposed to one shot, it must be set in servo to allow for that tracking to move to different focal planes. I noticed that as the subject moved closer, it wasn't so great in holding the focus. There were certain bursts where it actually locked onto the focus and I got some good shots, but as the subject continued to move much closer to the frame, I found that it tended to drop focus. Also, even though it was on animal tracking, it tended to lose focus on the animal even though it was plainly in the frame. And with that particular series, you'll notice it ended prematurely, and that was because I hit the buffer. That was one of the reasons I changed down to C-RAW. It could be something to think about and have it set in C-RAW to begin with, and I might not have had that issue. Okay, let's move to the next series. This one here, again, the subject was moving on a slight angle, but more or less from right to left of frame, and this was terrible. It didn't seem to pick up focus at all. I really feel like you have to nail your focus on your first shot, otherwise it just really doesn't have the opportunity to pick up and grab that focus along the way. Now, as mentioned, it could have been because of limitations with this lens. It's obviously going to be slower and not quite as responsive as the RF versions of the 70-200, but all the same, this is still a really, really incredible lens, and it works really well on the Canon EOS R in terms of picking up focus, so I kind of expected the same for the R7. What are your thoughts on that point? Let me know. Okay, so we move to the next series, and again, it's the subject moving towards us in the frame. And this is with the distraction of the fences below, so it's quite easy for the autofocus reticle to pull up on one of those fences. But in this case, as we move through the frames, it didn't really grab focus. Well, let me turn it this way. We're still coming through. It's having a real hard time picking up the focus of the subject. I actually found this series, again, quite disappointing. I didn't really get any shots out of this. And hey, it could be user error. Okay, give me a whipping down below if you want to, but I would have expected better from the camera. I mean, there's such talk about technology and the wonders it does for us. Maybe we're relying on that a little too much. That was a point that was brought up to me by Chris, one of my viewers, and it's actually a really, really great point, that we maybe don't pay enough attention to the other principles of photography because we're reliant on the technology, expecting it to work for us. And in situations when it doesn't work, it can be a little bit disconcerting or confusing as to why that might not be. But there could be a simple explanation for it. User error. That could be it. Okay, let's move to the next series. Okay, this series I was much more happy with. The subject was coming towards the frame, but I was able to fill the frame more with the horse and the rider, and it really did track onto the horse. I was really happy with the focus in pretty much all of these shots. As you can see through there, it didn't really lose focus at any point, and I got some cool shots as well along the way. So yeah, I was happy with this particular series. Of course, as I'm moving through the day, I am learning about how the camera lens responds, and I am reacting to that and adjusting my method slightly in terms of how I pick up the focus on the first shot and how I track the subject from there. So there is a learning curve of the operator, the user. Okay, so less user error, more camera success. But yeah, for that series, I was pretty happy. And these horses are moving fairly quickly, and they are changing their attitude in relation to the camera quite a lot, and there are a number of distractions. This series here, the subject is moving away from the camera on a diagonal, and I found that it did okay. As you can see here, quite a few of the shots are in focus, maybe not quite as tight as focused as I'd like, but still, it did an okay job. We are getting better here. Moving to the next series, this one was quite far in the distance, and there was a lot of distraction for the camera to pick up on. And it did seem to do an okay job, but as you can see towards the end, it really lost the focus quite quickly. Again, another diagonal shooting towards the camera, or the horse coming towards the camera, and this one was great. It picked up focus really, really well and held it throughout the series, but it was only a short burst, that series. Again, the horse moving left to right through the frame. It seems to be that when the subject is moving through the frame as opposed to toward or away from the frame, it actually makes it a little bit easier for the autofocus tracking to pick up and hold that plane of focus, which, when you think about it, makes sense. Okay, another series here with the subject moving directly towards the camera. It didn't quite pick up focus to start with, but it did recover. Another short series there. Let's go into this one slightly longer. Again, a lot of distraction, a lot further out, punched right into 200mm, and it did okay. It did drop focus a little bit, but for the most part, the focus held on the subject and the rider. This one here, again, moving left to right through the frame. As I say, I did not notice any issues with this kind of scenario, and as you can see here, there was nothing different in this particular series. Moving towards the camera, pretty okay, happy with this particular series. I think if you zoom right in on the face of the rider, it's not quite sharp, but here we're going to see the horse pass by the camera and then head away from the camera, so we can see how well the focus tracks, and so far it's doing pretty good. And you have to remember that these are blistering fast shots being belted off by the camera, so overall it did a pretty good job in this particular series. Now with the horse moving completely away from the camera, it's still holding on pretty good in situations that I'd be quite satisfied with that. Okay, another left to right, moving across the frame series, and this one, it was okay. I mean, everything seems to be in focus. What I did notice, and I'm not sure if it's illustrated in this particular series, is that sometimes the focus point would be on the horse or the subject or the rider right here, and then all of a sudden it would just snap to the edge of the frame onto a head. One of the spectators' heads, it would just snap onto their head, and then it was a real mission to try and recover and get it back onto the subject. In fact, in those situations when it did happen, that whole series was aborted. I noticed that predominantly happened more with video than it did with the still photography. It seemed to tack on a little bit tighter on the still photography than it did shooting video. So for me as a photo first shooter, that's good, but I also like for video to perform really well too, so it's annoying when it doesn't. But as you can see here, it did manage to stay on the subject and not latch on to the heads of the spectators off to the ringside. Okay, we're getting towards the last series here. Here it is, and for this particular rider coming towards the camera, it did okay, it held focus. Look, that's all the series I had. There was about, what, 15 series is there, and most of them were okay. There was a lot of shots that were out of focus. A couple of things I did notice, which was frustrating, and I did mention it just before, was the focus reticle, or the focus indicator, would suddenly snap to the edge of the frame and attach onto a fence, or it would attach onto a head. And that's quite frustrating because it's hard to recover in those situations, particularly when you're dealing with sports action that's over so quickly in the click of an eye. And look, I know I left the best shots out there in the arena. They are not in my camera. And even in those situations where you do get great shots, which should be celebrated, it's the ones you miss that tend to weigh a little bit heavier. I just wonder, if I got the shots I know I missed, would I have a winner? Would I be the photographer of the year for show jumping? I don't know. I mean, these questions can never be answered. But look, like I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert. It was my first outing with the R7 and the 70-200mm lens using the autofocus animal tracking mode. And I've got to say, yeah, I'm okay with it. It didn't do great. It didn't live up to where I thought the technology was going to take me. I thought overnight I was going to be a show jumping photographer phenomenon, but not to be. It looks like I, as the operator, are going to need to put more work into knowing how the camera and how the autofocus and how the tracking and how the lens all react and work together. And once I can hone in on those points, maybe I'm going to be able to produce better results. And one thing, I'll definitely drop in and show you those then. In the meantime, if you have any thoughts about what you noticed during some of those series, please let me know down below. But this is just to give you food for thought, something to help with your considerations of whether or not the R7 is going to be a legendary powerhouse for sports photography, or whether you may end up being a little bit nonplussed about it. Have a great day. Thanks heaps for watching, and we're going to catch you next time. Bye!